Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us for this two-day Mason Institute event on developing a career in bioethics and health law. I'm delighted that so many of you have registered and are here today to join us for a couple hours, both today and tomorrow. And I'll explain more about the aims in a second and the 4 sessions that we have planned. We're delighted to have so many speakers from across universities in the UK to offer their insights to you. And plenty of time, of course, for all of you to ask questions about any of the sessions that we have, be it today's sessions on PhD and research, and tomorrow's sessions on writing grant applications and career opportunities in bioethics and health law. Before I turn to those aims, I might ask Professor Anne-Marie Farrell, who's the director of the Mason Institute, to say a few opening words, and then I'll explain a bit more about the aims of today's workshop, and then we'll get started with our first session. Anne-Marie?
Hello, Ted, are you there? I don't know if I've come up on the screen. It's not showing me.
I can see you, yeah.
You can. Oh, that's okay. I seem to have disappeared from my own screen. So welcome, everybody. A very, very warm welcome from all of us at the Mason Institute. As Ted pointed out, I am the director of the Institute. For those of you who don't know much about the background of the Institute, it's an interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary research institute. People who have backgrounds in bioethics, social sciences, and the law, we're all interested in that relationship as it applies in the areas of medicine, life sciences, and the law. We're particularly delighted that through the good work of my colleague Ted Dove that we're organising this event today. We see it as extremely important to support early career researchers and postgraduate students in particular in terms of contemplating a career in bioethics and health law, but also providing them with mentoring and skills that would enable them to pursue that career. So it's very important, these types of events, as well as providing ongoing support to our early career and postgraduate cohort. And today you're going to get an introduction to a wide array of subjects that we hope you'll find helpful in contemplating or pursuing a career in the area, ranging from grant writing, mentoring, publishing, all those sorts of areas that are very important in terms of pursuing a career in the area. So without further ado, I'm going to turn you over and back to Ted, and he'll introduce the event in more detail. I'll be participating in terms of managing the chat box and hopefully addressing any questions you might have and passing it on to our great speakers. Before I do, I'd like to thank Ted for organising the day. I'd also like to thank, or the event I should say, we don't have days anymore, do we? Because we're online. I suppose it is during the day. I'd also like to thank our speakers for giving up their time. They're highly experienced in these areas, and I think you're really going to enjoy the tips and insights that they provide to you today. So welcome and enjoy the event. Thanks, Ted.
Thanks very much, Anne-Marie. And yes, just to say a little bit more about the event over today and tomorrow, and the impetus for it and what we've got planned. I also just want to echo the thanks to Anne-Marie for being director of Mason Institute and steering us very, very ably, and also to all of our speakers both today and tomorrow for taking the time out of their busy schedules to prepare these sessions for you, particularly in a challenging time. So we are extremely grateful. And I should also thank Rebecca Richards and Katrina McMillan and the events team at the law school for helping organize this event. Just to add a bit more to what Anne-Marie said, so the Mason Institute is an interdisciplinary network based at Edinburgh Law School that looks at ethical, legal, and social and political issues at the interface of medicine, life sciences, and law. And we've been a research center for approaching 10 years now, which is very exciting. And as part of our portfolio of activities, we always hold at a regular basis events geared towards ideally younger scholars. And so in past years, we've had monthly lunches with visiting researchers, delivering insights into their ongoing research activities. And that's often quite popular amongst our postgraduate research community. But we also thought it'd be useful to hold a standalone event on developing careers in bioethics and health law. And we wanted to build on the networks that we've been building across the UK, primarily both through the Northern Bioethics Network connections, but also just across our universities and colleagues in the UK throughout the nations. And so what we wanted to do was think about topics that might particularly appeal to both postgraduate top students, but also those either thinking about postgraduate research or those already in postgraduate research, but also those who are at the early stage of their career. So they might be a teaching fellow, research fellow, or postdoc more generally, and thinking about how they can leverage, their skill sets that they've already gained in their educational credentials they've already gained to think about how I can write a grant application and start to continue to build my career and get myself on firm footing. So to that end, we thought about 4 main areas that we think would be useful to those of you at the early stage in your career, from the master's level and upwards. And so for today, we have 2 sessions. The first one is on writing PhD research proposals. So what it means to make a PhD application and think about devising a topic that is suitable for doctoral research. And then what it means to engage in writing the thesis itself. So I'll speak in a moment about our 2 opening speakers there. And then following that session this morning, we have a second session on writing and publishing your research. So separate from the nature of thesis writing itself, what does it mean to write a research article? What does it mean to write a monograph, perhaps? So we have 2 great speakers for that session, and I'll introduce them when that session begins. And then I hope you're all able to stick around for tomorrow at the same time tomorrow, 10 a.m. UK time. We'll have 2 sessions. The first one on writing grant applications, which is an area of particular importance, arguably more in health law and bioethics than other areas in law, I would say, given our almost natural disposition to be interdisciplinary and to apply for different funding bodies. And the type of research we do in health law naturally lends itself to engaging in funded research. And then our last session, perhaps the one that you're most interested in, but I don't know, career opportunities in bioethics and health law. So how do you turn the LLM or the master's degree or the PhD or the postdoc into something longer term, permanent or otherwise? And so we'll talk about the plethora of opportunities in bioethics and health law, which need not be focused exclusively, of course, in academia. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our 2 speakers. Or perhaps first, before I do, I would just note that the session is being recorded, and we had the kind acceptance of our speakers today to have that recording so that you can watch this at a later date. And I think our events team at the university will put this on the YouTube channel so that you can view it later on. The chat function is also open so that you're all able to communicate and ask your questions. I would just ask, unless the presenters say otherwise, to perhaps hold off on your questions until the end of their session, unless they want to have it engaged in throughout, and that's fine, then they can do so. And likewise, the microphone, I believe, is currently turned off, but again, I leave that up to the presenters if they want to turn it on. And then, of course, during the Q&A session itself, I'll make sure that that's engaged. I think that's it in terms of housekeeping. So let me go ahead then to introduce our 2 speakers. So we're delighted to have Dr. Jonathan Ives and Dr. Mary Neal with us today to start the first session on writing PhD research proposals and thesis writing. Dr. Jonathan Ives is a reader in empirical bioethics at Bristol Medical School, and he works across clinical and research ethics. And as the title implies, he has particular expertise in empirical bioethics methodology, and his work currently focuses on best interests in innovation. And I know he's busy with 2 funded projects right now. He is a principal investigator of the UKRI Trustworthy Autonomous Systems Node in Evolving Functionality, and that's being conducted at Bristol Medical School. And then he's a co-investigator on a big project, which is looking at balancing best interests in healthcare, ethics, and law. And we're also very much delighted to have Dr. Mary Neal, a reader in law at the University of Strathclyde. And she is also the Deputy Head of School of Law with responsibility for policy and practice. And she's currently a member of the British Medical Association's Medical Ethics Committee. And in the past, she's advised the Parliamentary Committee scrutinizing the Assisted Suicide Scotland Bill. And Dr. Neal's main research interests are in healthcare law, bioethics, and legal theory. And her current research focuses on conscientious objection in healthcare, beginning and end-of-life issues, theories of property, and metadisciplinary concepts such as dignity, sanctity, and love. So without further ado, I turn it over to Jonathan and Mary. Thank you both very much again for joining us today.
Thanks, Ted. Thanks, Ted. So good morning, everyone. I am Dr. Mary Neal, and my colleague, Dr. Jonathan Ives, and I are going to speak to you today about writing PhD proposals and theses. So we'll begin by introducing ourselves, and then we'll have a conversation which will cover quite a lot of ground. And after that, there will be a Q&A where you'll have the opportunity to ask questions that possibly we haven't covered, or to ask us to expand on things maybe that we have covered, but you would like to hear us say more about. So on the next slide, our introductions. So I, as Ted said, I'm Dr. Mary Neal. I'm a reader in law at the University of Strathclyde. I've been teaching and researching in medical law and ethics since 2003. I've also got expertise and interest in the theory of property law, and I find quite a lot of intersection across those areas. My own PhD was awarded in 2005. Scary to think how long ago that was now. And since then, I've supervised 5 PhD students to completion as either a first or a second supervisor. And at the moment, I'm currently engaged in supervising 2 PGR students. And as well as the supervision, I've been a reviewer for other PhD students in the department. I've also been an external examiner on several PhDs in other institutions, and I've chaired PhD panels. So I can speak from all of that experience, and hand over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Mary. Can I just check, can everybody see the slides? Okay, I think I've got the slides and the screen sorted. Is it coming through okay?
Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. So yeah, but I guess these slides are more about trying to orient Mary and I in with regard to this topic. I think it's often kind of taken for granted that, you know, but if you're an academic, you can speak to this, but I guess it's not true for everybody. So we just want to really show our closeness and engagement with PhDs and PGR students. So I'm, as Ted said, I'm a reader in empirical bioethics. I've been working in bioethics for about 17 years. PhD was awarded in 2007. I've simply, Mary, supervised 5 postgrad students to date, and I'm currently supervising 7 across PhD and Masters by Research at varying stages. Some just started, some about to submit. And I've examined lots and lots of theses and shared vivas and progress reviews. And I've also been postgraduate research director at Bristol Medical School, which really was an eye-opening experience, because it exposed me to a lot of different kinds of PhD work and doctoral work. And I guess that the key point is that between us, we've seen and reviewed many applications, proposals, and theses. And so we've got a good sense, I guess, of what looks good to us and what looks less good. But I guess the important caveat is that this is from mine and Mary's perspective. And I think whilst we can talk quite broadly, we will be giving you our opinions and our interpretations. And I guess the key thing is that you need to speak to the people in front of you, the people assessing your application or the people examining you. So take these as observations from our experience, but not necessarily as the only way to go, and get advice from as many people as possible. I'll just move on the slide, Mary, if I can.
Yeah.
Right, there we go. So I think I'm speaking to this slide then. The first thing we're going to talk about is writing a PhD proposal. That's often the starting point, and whether this is as part of seeking funding or just seeking a PhD place at a in university, at some point you're going to have to engage with this. And I think it's fair to say that writing a PhD proposal is more an art than a science. There's not a defined way to do it, but there are certain notes you'll need to hit, and what we'll try to do is take you through some of those notes. But broadly speaking, somebody who is assessing your proposal, whether it's a fully fleshed out grant application for doctoral study or an application for a place for doctoral study, reviewers and admissions officers are going to be looking at the 3 Ps. And I have to credit my colleague Richard Huxtable for describing it in this way. And he talks about the person, the project, and the place. And we've amended it slightly because we don't think it's just about the person, we think it's about the people involved. So we'll take you through what we're looking for when we're thinking about the people, the project, and the place. So there's broadly 2 groups of people who really count when we're looking to assess an application or an application for doctoral study, and they are the applicant themselves, so you, if you're at that stage, and the supervisors or the supervisory team. And I think the way we're going to run these sessions is that Mary is going to, we're going to try to run it as a conversation between Mary and I. And so I think I'm handing over to Mary to ask me questions.
Yes, I'm going to start by quizzing Jonathan about the applicant and about the points that he's put on this slide. So he's asking, are you the right person for a PhD, first of all? So what that makes me think immediately is that, you know, built into that question is the presumption that a PhD isn't necessarily for everyone. So, I mean, it can seem to us, I think, Jonathan and myself and others who are academics, that almost everybody we know seems to have a PhD, or that, you know, almost everyone we know. But I think that's in our own networks. And I think that it's probably true to say that taking it as a view across the population, it's still a relatively small number of people that have PhDs. So I just wanted to ask Jonathan to speak a bit about being the right person. What makes somebody suited to approaching or attempting a PhD?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. It's quite easy to take for granted that, you know, the majority of people in your professional circle have a PhD, and it becomes normal. And if you're in that academic world and you've not got a PhD, it does seem like a bit of an outlier. And I guess, first of all, it's worth saying a PhD isn't essential to be involved in research or academic work. I think if you want to be a principal investigator or get lots of grant funding and have a research career, it'll be challenging to do that without a PhD, but it's not necessary to have one to work in an academic environment. And I guess if we're asking the question, are you the right person for a PhD, it risks kind of the idea that only certain kinds of people can do a PhD. There are groups, you know, typically well-educated or advantaged people. And I think historically that's certainly been the case. I think certainly you've needed to have the funds to do a PhD, for example. They're not cheap. I think there is lots of PhD funding around, and the whole point of that funding is really to try and reward excellence, to try and allow people who aren't in a position financially to support themselves to do it, to be able to do further study. So when we're talking about the right person, we're really talking about, are you a person with the right characteristics and aptitude? We're not kind of looking at groups of people who would typically be thought of as typical in the academy. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I think so. So the answer to the question is these 3 other points on the slide. So do you have the right motivation? Do you have the right attitude? And do you have the relevant aptitudes? So starting with motivation, can I ask you, Jonathan, what would be some examples in your view of good reasons for wanting to do a PhD? And maybe slightly more difficult question, what might be some examples of less good reasons?
Well, I remember when I was applying to do my PhD, I was working up a funding application with my soon-to-be supervisor, and I realise now that I really had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I think I was very fortunate that I had a very patient supervisor who was willing to tell me in a kindly way that what I was writing was a bit silly. And I was kind of trying to be a bit jovial. And one of the things I wrote was never apart from really wanting to be called doctor. And at the time, I thought it was a bit of a flippant, funny thing to say. By the way, it's not worth putting flippant or funny things in a PhD application. But I think just wanting to have that title, that idea of prestige, is, I think, probably the worst reason you can possibly want to do a PhD. Luckily, I think I was motivated by more than that. But I think there is a kind of status associated with a PhD, being able to call yourself doctor. You know, if that's really the only reason that you want to do a PhD, I would say you're going to really struggle. But I think the good motivations for wanting to do a PhD are being passionate about the subject. I think even being passionate about research and academic research in general probably isn't enough, because you have to be passionate and really enjoy the topic and the area of research that your PhD is, because it's going to be your bedfellow for the next 3 or 4 years. You're going to be living and breathing it, and if you don't really love what you're doing, it's going to be very challenging. And I guess the key difficulty is that you can be well motivated, you can have that motivation, but you have to try and get that across in on paper, but in the application, and then in person if you're interviewed.
Yeah, so that's one part of the puzzle. Having the right motivation and this passion is very key to that. What about the next part of the puzzle, the attitude? What kind of attitudes do you think are going to be helpful for someone who's doing a PhD? And are there any kinds of attitudes or approaches or states of mind that you think would be a drawback?
Yeah, well, I guess at the moment, there's no single right or wrong answer. But I think you want, when we're interviewing candidates, we want somebody who is kind of excited and open-minded. The worst thing we might see in a candidate is somebody who appears closed-minded, who thinks they've got the answers, and this is the question they're asking, and this is the answer they're going to find. So any hint of being quite fixed and rigid in your thinking and your approach is probably going to switch people off. I guess so in terms of attitude, it's about seeing research as a challenge, about a step into the unknown, and not being the sort of person, or not coming across as the sort of person who is going to give up when it doesn't go right, because almost certainly it will go wrong.
So perseverance is very important, but also this idea of a genuinely inquiring mind. I would agree. I'd be very put off if somebody applied to do a PhD with me and sounded as if they had already answered the question for themselves and weren't open to. I mean, I think it's fair to say that people do tend to start the project with an idea of how they might answer a question, but the key thing here is being open to changing your mind about it, and going where the research takes you, because the PhD is 3 or 4 years or more if you're doing it part-time. Of deep diving into the literature and into the arguments and ideas in an area. And if you think you're going to do that for 3 or 4 years and not go on an intellectual journey, I think that's an alarm bell for me. So what about aptitudes then? And here I'm intrigued by the fact that you've said demonstrate your academic ability beyond just listing your qualifications. And I think for most of us, and me included, that would seem to be the obvious way of displaying your academic credentials. Here are my qualifications. So how, apart from listing your qualifications, do you think applicants can demonstrate academic ability in an application? What other ways are there of demonstrating academic ability?
Thanks. It's tricky because I guess you can't get away from the fact that however well motivated you are, however great your attitude is, you do also have to be able to demonstrate that you've got that baseline academic ability. And yeah, the basic way to show that is, well, I've got these exam results, I've got this degree, I've got this master's. But I guess the problem is that almost everybody you're potentially competing against is going to have that. So that doesn't make you stand out. And what you really want to be doing on an application is going that extra mile. So if you're writing a PhD proposal, if you've been asked to write a 1-page, 2-page, 30-page, depending on whether you're going for funding, application and a proposal, use that, or that is a really good place to show you've gone that extra mile, you've thought about research methods, you've done a bit of research, you know the literature. So listing the qualifications is great, but that's the baseline, that's the very minimum, and everyone else is going to have that. What you want to do is show that you can go a little bit further. And the research proposal is a great place to do that, by showing you know the topic, that you know how to go about doing it, and really that you've thought about the research process.
That's very, very important. And obviously we're going to be talking a bit more in detail later about writing the proposal, so we'll maybe hold that discussion over for the later slides, and just move on and talk about the supervisory team.
Yeah. So I think I'm then going to ask Mary some questions. And I guess in supervisory team are the other set of people that we're talking about that people are going to be interested in. And I mean, Mary, you've said it's really essential to get this right. I mean, that suggests that it's really, really important. I mean, why is it so important, would you say?
Well, I think it's absolutely fundamental. And I think that's because, as we've already touched on, the PhD is quite a big chunk out of your life. It's 3 or 4 years, or possibly more if you're doing it part-time, as we said. So that's quite a major chunk of time. And within that chunk of time, there will be the usual ups and downs of life alongside the academic project that you're engaged in. So life will be going on in parallel with that and will be affecting it in some ways. And your supervisor, your supervisory team, hopefully you will be surrounded by people or have access to people who will be supportive of you, and who will be able to, bear you up when things get tough. So hopefully your supervisory team won't be your only port of call for that, but they are a guaranteed, or they should be a guaranteed port of call. So the supervisor or supervisors are the people that are going to be there with you for the distance. They're going to be your intellectual guides. They're also going to be providing other kinds of guidance to you. So you're starting out maybe not just on a PhD, but on an academic career. So they're going to be your guides for that. They're going to be people that you can talk to about academia, people who will be key references for you as you move out of the PhD and into your first academic job. They'll be helping you to get those jobs by writing references for you. They will be hopefully introducing you to their networks. They are likely to be the first people that you co-author academic publications with. So this is someone who's going to loom very large in your life, and particularly in that aspect of your life, your entrance into academia. Sure. So I think it's very important that that be a good working relationship, and it be somebody who works well with you and that you work well with them.
Yeah, and I guess that's encapsulated by the next kind of point where you've asked the question, whose office do you want to talk in to when things are going badly? And I can see why that would matter to you as the applicant, but could you maybe explain a bit about why that would matter to the admissions officer or the funder who is assessing your application? Why should they care if you're comfortable with your supervisor, so long as the job gets done?
Yeah, so from the point of view of the person who's assessing your application and who's deciding whether or not they're going to give the go-ahead to this project, pastoral support and working well together can make or break the whole thing. So you could be a great intellectual candidate, you could be somebody, your supervisor could have the right expertise and you could be a very good match on that level. But if they can't support you when things are, and you can't ask for help when things are going wrong and they can't give that help, then that's a real fault line in the whole project. And whoever is assessing the project and deciding whether or not it should go ahead has to have a kind of bird's eye view of the whole project and has to be confident that this is a project that can survive the ups and downs, that can go the distance. And pastoral support is absolutely crucial in ensuring that that a project can go the distance.
Okay, and I guess next you talk about doing homework and ensuring that they've got, for example, the right expertise, that they're experienced, that they're trustworthy, that they're kind, that they have integrity. I'll pick on just a few of those. I mean, the right expertise seems relatively straightforward, but in terms of experience, I mean, is it the case that you have to get the most senior professor in your department? Is there a problem getting somebody more junior, less experienced?
No, and I would say maybe the contrary. I mean, senior professors will definitely have the right expertise. They will have a lot of experience of supervising projects and getting students to completion. That is important, and your supervisor needs to be able to do that. But senior professors also have an awful lot of other things going on as well. And anecdotally, I have heard from people who have embarked upon PhDs with very distinguished supervisors, and then find that the person isn't making time for them, or that they're anxious about the amount of time that the person spends overseas or on visiting fellowships in other places. And so it can be a double-edged sword to have the most senior person. Now, I also know of very many very senior and distinguished academics who are extremely attentive and kind and supportive supervisors. So what really matters is the person and not how senior they are. In terms of seniority, what you need is they need to clear the bar. They need to be somebody who is trained to supervise PhDs, because I think we all now in our institutions have to complete courses. I certainly did, had to complete a course that qualified me to supervise PhDs before I was allowed to do that. It helps if they have a PhD themselves in some ways, but that's not necessary either. I think you said, Jonathan, at the beginning that many very distinguished academics joined the profession at a time when it wasn't necessarily the norm, and certainly not essential to have a PhD. What really, that's not I wouldn't regard that as a drawback, because sometimes if somebody has done their own PhD, they might have fixed ideas about how a PhD should be done. It should be done the way they successfully completed theirs. Not having that experience can actually be an advantage, I think. What matters is really other things. I think the things that I've listed here matter more than the person having a PhD of their own, or being, necessarily the most senior or biggest name in the department. I think having the right expertise. I think a supervisor, certainly I wouldn't agree to supervise a project that I felt I didn't have the right expertise for. That wouldn't be right for me or for the applicant. It would be a bad experience for both. Experience is important, but someone who's earlier in their career, maybe a few years out of their own PhD, might be an advantage, as long as they're qualified to do it. I think don't be afraid to ask someone who is a prospective supervisor how many PhDs they've supervised to completion, if that matters to you. I've been asked that question by applicants, and I've been happy to answer it. So I think when you're in discussions with prospective supervisors, I think you shouldn't be frightened to ask them about that. Being a trustworthy ally, this person, as I said, is going to be a key ally for you, not just during the PhD, but beyond it, as a referee, as someone who's opening up networks to you. Are they kind? I mean, that goes back to this question, which I can't take credit for. I saw that on Twitter. Somebody had said, whose office do you want to walk into when things are going badly? I wouldn't want to walk into the office of someone that I didn't think was kind, or didn't have integrity, or didn't care about me. So I think all of these things are really important to bear in mind. They're not the kind of things that you'll find on people's staff pages, how kind they are, or how much integrity they've got, how trustworthy they are, and how much of an ally they'll be to you. We don't talk about those things on staff pages, so that's something that you need to get a sense of by meeting the person and speaking to people who know them.
Great, thank you, Mary. I think we should move on to the next slide, which is about the place, the second P. So this is the idea that the place does matter, and it may not be all important, and there's a couple of things to consider. So I think I was going to ask you, Mary, again. So I guess first question is, I think we do tend to assume that if you do a PhD, one of the big benefits, one of the things you do is you move away. You can kind of striking out. But I know you would want to say something about that not being the most important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there can be strong pull factors, I've called them here. Things like if there's a very big name in your field or the field that you want to get into in a particular place, that might be a factor that tends to pull you towards that place. The excitement or even the glamour of working with that big name person. There might also be, reasons why people have to move away. So sometimes people might have to move away to get funding. So maybe you've decided and determined that a PhD is the next step for you. And the only way to do that is to get a funded place. And perhaps the funded places that are available are in slightly further afield institutions. So you might need to move for funding. You might want to move for a big name supervisor. You might want to move just because you might have done already maybe an undergraduate degree and a master's somewhere. That was the case for me. I'd done my undergraduate, my honours degree and my master's both at Glasgow University. So although they had a wonderful medical law institute in Glasgow University at the time, I moved to do my PhD at Cardiff. Because I felt, that I had been in one place for long enough. So there can be lots of reasons to move away, but I suppose we're all very aware of those reasons, and I just wanted to sound a note on the other side of the balance, which is there are also reasons sometimes to stay where you are. Don't feel that you need to move away. What matters most to you when you're going through the PhD experience? And what I would say is something that should matter a great deal to you is the availability of a support network. We've talked already about the length of time that a PhD takes, about how many ups and downs there are. I think it's fair to say that in all my experience of doing a PhD, but also supervising postgraduate students, I have yet to come across the plain sailing PhD where someone just starts their PhD, works their way through it and finishes, and it's all gone swimmingly and nobody's had any problems. So these things do happen. I had problems, and other people that I've supervised have had problems, and all the people that I speak to, and as we both said, Jonathan, most of the people we know have PhDs, so we've heard many PhD stories, and so therefore support is always going to be key. Do you have the support where you are? Is it important to you? If so, that might be a reason to stay where you are. So I think that's something to.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that in my role as postgrad research director, of the students who I've had in my office who are struggling for a multitude of reasons, the common factor in life and the PhD being hard, and particularly hard, is a lack of support network. Yeah. And I think that is really key. And I think that when I was applying for funding for my PhD, and Mary, it may be the same for you, it seemed to be very much the case that the key funders, what they actually wanted was you to move around from place to place, and certainly to get postdoc funding, you had to move. If you just stayed at the same place, you were stagnating. You needed to move, and that put a lot of pressure on people, particularly if, like me, had family commitments and you had roots down. I think now that is much less the case. But I think what's important now is justifying the place that you're looking to be in, rather than just trying to move for the sake of moving.
I agree with that, Jonathan, and I think that goes well beyond the PhD as well. Certainly in my career began when I was awarded my PhD. Before that, actually, my first job was in 2003. I got the PhD in 2005. And in the early period of my career, it was definitely the case that you rose much more quickly and through the promoted ranks if you were willing to move about from institution to institution. And that was something that I was never keen to do. I was keen to get a job in my own hometown and to stay there. So I've kind of bucked that trend myself. So I do feel quite strongly about the fact that if you do want to stay in one place and you're not keen to move around, that's an absolutely valid life choice. And yes, there might be some cost to that in terms of the the speed of your rise through the professional ranks. However, it's for each person to decide whether they're happy to pay that price. And I think, as somebody who has chosen to stay where they are, I think that's absolutely, it's just as valid to say I'll have a slower career in one place, and it's also valid to say I want a fast career in lots of places. But I think it's for individuals to decide what's going to fulfill them and make them happy.
I guess it is possible to have a fast career in one place as well. It is, they're not mutually exclusive, I guess. Or
it depends on a lot of things.
Less so now than it was.
Depends on your life circumstances and many other factors.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on to the next bit of place, the academic environment. I think, Mary, you were going to lead on this one.
Yes, I'm going to ask you about this, Jonathan. So you've talked about a thriving PGR community. So I just wanted to drill down a bit into the word thriving and what you think that means, and what would be the signs of a thriving PhD community in a place.
Yeah, I guess this is something I would always throw back to the person who is applying. So I think what is really, really key when you're looking at the academic environment is you don't want to be isolated. A PhD in postgraduate research is very challenging, and we as supervisors and academics, we can tell you this as much as we like, and we can offer as much support as we possibly can. But what you do need is peer support, to be around people who you can access and who you know and who are going through the same thing as you are. And I think that is really, really essential and can make the difference between a good and a bad experience. So in what you think of as thriving might vary. So the important thing to you maybe is there a thriving social life amongst the PGR community. You might think, are there thriving seminar series? Is everybody really high achiever and so on? But whatever you look for in a PhD community, is that there? And I think it is really important to look at that when you are thinking about which institution to go to.
Yeah. So, and you've talked about support being available. We've talked a lot about that already. What kinds of support would you say are important in the academic environment itself?
I think really what we need to be looking for is a breadth of both academic and pastoral support. And I guess the first point of call for both of those is always your supervisor. But your supervisor is not always available. Your supervisor is not perfect. Much as we like to think we are, we're not. So you want to know that the university itself and the institutional structure has support structures there, which might range from welfare services, financial aid. I think one of the big challenges of postgraduate study, especially if you're even if you're funded or non-funded, is if you're ill. There's no maternity, paternity or sick pay. There are for certain funding schemes, but not all funding schemes. There's a huge amount of inequality there. If you're in the difficult position of being ill and needing to carry on, but not being able to carry on, because if you stop working and suspend studies, your stipend is suspended. What kind of support is there for you? And so a whole range from academic support. You know, if your supervisor is ill or off, do you have people? Is there enough depth in your department or your school for somebody to be able to step into that role, or will you be essentially bereft of a supervisor? I think these are all the kinds of questions that you can ask prospective supervisors and of people currently studying. And I guess building on that in terms of academic support is, but how invested is the institution and your supervisors and the people around you in helping you develop a career, depending on what you want to do. So we think of CV building in academia in terms of building an academic CV, but not everybody who does a PhD wants to go on to be an academic. So what kind of range of training opportunities are there, and what kind of support is in place for you to be able to develop the kind of CV that you want for the career that you want, bearing in mind, of course, that might change as your PhD progresses. You might start to want different things.
Yeah, and I think a key thing is to impress on everyone that it's absolutely fine to ask these detailed questions when you're considering embarking on a PhD in a department. I think nobody's going to mind if you ask about the breadth and depth of of knowledge in your subject area. That's obviously a very practical concern. You mentioned people being off sick. PhD supervisors might move away, and when they do, different institutions will have different practices in relation to whether they take their students with them or whether you're passed over to another supervisor. So I think it's absolutely fine to have questions about that and to want to know more. So.
Okay. So I think, Mary, we've got about 10 minutes left. We should probably move on if we can.
Okay.
Is that all right? Sorry. Just realised we've been talking too much. So the next point is about the project. And I guess the point that I wanted, excuse the mazy image, but the question I think most PhD students will get asked kind of almost every week is what are you doing? What are you actually doing? And this is the project. This is your raison d'etre for being there. I think the point I want to make here is that you could have the best project in the world. You could have an absolutely great project, but it might not get accepted or funded. What gets accepted or funded is the great application. What you need is a great project, but you need a great application as well. You need to be able to sell it. So loads of great projects don't get funded because the application is not any good. So there is an art and a skill to writing an application. The project is the baseline, but the application is what sells it.
And so I was going to ask you about this slide as well, Jonathan. So
yeah.
Two main things I wanted you to just elaborate on. First, the first point on the slide seems to be a really key one. And I wondered if you could just speak a bit about the different kinds of application that people might be making and decipher some of these terms for anyone who's not sure what's the difference between a specific funded programme or an existing grant or a general application.
Sure. So, I mean, bearing in mind that the audience here is very diverse, and I know that lots of you already know this, but some of you won't. So, I mean, when you're looking to do a PhD, you can apply to do a PhD anywhere at any time, and doing a PhD incurs academic fees, university fees, which you'll know, but some PhDs have research costs associated as well. And you've also got to live whilst doing your PhD. So you can apply just for a place at a university to do a PhD, but you then have to come up with the fees and you've got to support yourself as well. And that's what we might call a self-funded PhD, where you're using your own resources. Lots of PhDs have research costs associated with it, and they're going to essentially be a full-time job. So for that kind of PhD, you really want to be looking for funding. So then you can apply for a funded PhD, and there's various ways to do this. You may have universities and schools will offer funded PhDs where they've already got the funding and it's there, and they'll pay you a stipend and research costs and cover your fees, and you've got to apply for that. Alternatively, you could find a supervisor willing to support you to write an application for an externally funded PhD. And this may be, for example, in bioethics, one of the big funders of these is the Wellcome Trust. But you might write up an application, which is normally about 60 to 70 pages, including CVs, why the institution is perfect, a 5-page research proposal, and so on, and ask them to fund you. And sometimes if you're a clinician, some programs will fund your clinical salary, some will offer a standard stipend. I think the key thing, once you identify a PhD, and if you say find one to apply for, it's really important to make sure you know, is it funded up or unfunded, and what are you expected to pay? So, check the regulations and processes of the institutions you're looking at and just find out what they offer.
Yeah, and you've talked a bit on the slide about engaging with supervisors, with PGR directors in the school about funding opportunities, and with the supervisor about structuring the research question, the plan, finding your feet in the subject area. One thing that I wanted to ask you on this slide, since we're kind of trying to move on quickly, is the final point that you make, which is about making yourself stand out. So I think on the next slide, there are maybe some, it might itemize some of the ways in which you can do this in a general application, but presumably if the application is for a PhD that's attached to an existing grant, presumably one of the ways you would want to make yourself stand out in the application would be to demonstrate knowledge of the project and the supervisor's related work, would you say?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, showing you've done your homework and you're invested in the subject by demonstrating an extended knowledge about both the topic, the project, and the place is essential. But I guess the point about the timing and making yourself stand out is essentially about the fact that in funders and institutions get loads and loads of inquiries about PhD. We're doing a bit of an audit at the moment about our PhD inquiries in my centre, and over the last 5 years we've had about 80 just off the cuff inquiries, just emails to myself and colleagues saying I'd like to do a PhD. And you can't, whilst you can respond to them all in some way, you can't engage with them all, you can't accept them all. So if you're making an inquiry of a potential supervisor, you want to really make yourself stand out from the crowd so that when they read your inquiry, think, wow, this person is knowledgeable, this person has done their homework, and this is somebody it's worth spending time investing in, particularly if you want their support getting funding, because that is a big investment in terms of time.
Yeah, and obviously engaging with your supervisor, your prospective supervisor, is absolutely key here, because I think a lot of us get these PhD proposals that land cold in our inboxes, where the person has never contacted us, has never engaged with us prior to sending us this lengthy document.
Yeah.
All the people that I have supervised, I have to say, are people who have approached me informally, and I've met with some of them several times before we've begun the project. So I think, yes, engaging with your supervisor early is absolutely key.
Yeah. Also, just despite the image that we've got, I always find it really weird when people put photos on their CV.
Yeah.
Because I don't care.
I don't care what you look like.
And it looks like they think you do, and that always annoys me.
Yeah.
Right. So writing a proposal, Mary, you've kind of given a checklist of things to cover, and again, I think we've not got time to go through it all. But I guess the starting point, I mean, my opinion is always that it starts with the research question, and everything flows from there. But I guess if you've never done it before, if this is your first time, how can you know you're getting that right?
You can engage with your supervisor early, Jonathan, just as you said in the previous slide. So I think it's fair to assume, and you've said much earlier on, we're not looking for finished, polished products. We're looking for people with potential, and people who have the potential to write an excellent PhD don't necessarily start this part of the process knowing what to do. That's why it's so important to engage with the person who you think might be your supervisor, and ask for their help in all of this. You go for a meeting with them, talk to them, tell them what you're interested in investigating, and they will help you to hammer that into a research question. That's usually the first thing that I do with the people who come to me looking for supervision. I do prefer a research question to be framed as a question. And the other thing is, this will not by any means be the last version of your research question. Your research question will evolve, and it will take turns and go on a journey over the lifetime of your doctoral research. And that's to be expected. Your plan similarly will evolve and change, and that shouldn't frighten you. But I think you do need to start with a clear idea of what you're doing, and your supervisor is the person who has the experience and the expertise to help you to get a handle on that.
And I guess your fourth line about timeliness, that's really important. And I think I see applications where people identify a gap in the research and say, and that's a reason to answer this question, but you really need a bit more.
Yeah, you need more than that. So if, timeliness, I've also further down the page talked about your stakeholders, the possible impact that your work might have. Again, these are things that you're not expected to know about, but that a supervisor can talk through with you, and you can come to some sort of understanding of that through discussion with them. These are all things that are important. First of all, because if you need funding, if you're self-funding, you're much freer to pursue any project that interests you. If you're needing funding from somebody, a funding body is only going to fund a project like you, Jonathan. They get hundreds and thousands of applications for their money, and they will only be even considering things that are timely, that have clear stakeholders and audiences, and that have a clear potential for impact. So you might not even get your project off the ground unless you can demonstrate these things. But also, I think there's a question about why you would want to be doing a project. If it's not just for your own personal interest, is it not? Don't you want to contribute to knowledge in a meaningful and timely way? So I think those are all important things, but again, things that your supervisor, prospective supervisor, will be able to help you to get an understanding of.
Thanks, Mary. I think you should probably move on as well. So the next bit is a few tips about thesis writing itself. And so, Mary, I think you were just going to speak to these slides.
Yes, so again, I think they're fairly self-explanatory. It's more of a checklist, really. Start writing early, even if that's just jotting down notes. You will start writing early because the first thing you're going to do, I think, in consultation with your supervisor is to write your research question and a plan. These are the things that we've said will evolve, but they're a starting point. And I think by even just drafting your plan, you are beginning to start writing. And I think the first things you'll write other than that will just be annotating the literature that you read, and sometimes jotting down the thoughts that you have as a result of that reading. I think it is important to keep yourself in the habit of writing. And one of the things I've said here is devise strategies for getting back on track. And I'll just share briefly an experience that I had in my PhD, which was that I fell into a bit of a slump midway through the PhD, and I felt I had nothing to say. I wasn't writing, and my supervisor said to me, why don't you just write book reviews of novels that you've read, so things that are nothing to do with your work, just to maintain the habit of writing and the practice of writing and the discipline of writing. So there are things that you can do to just keep yourself writing, even when you don't feel like looking at your project or writing or reading about your project. There are other things that you can do that are not explicitly connected with your project, but that are keeping the same sorts of skills ticking over during difficult periods. So I would pull that out as a particularly important point. Have strategies for getting back on track, because as we both said, there will be times when when your project goes off the rails a bit.
Yeah, I imagine that in the Q&A there'll be many people. I can see the names of some attendees who I know are in the middle of their PhDs. I imagine they'll be able to speak to that as well. Yeah. So finally, we've got the viva, and the image that I've picked is partly because one of the things I did to distract myself during my PhD was attempt to learn ninjutsu, and another is that I think the viva is often kind of portrayed as this big ordeal that you have to survive. You almost need ninja academic skills to survive it. It's going to be this big, terrible battle. And I think in some places that's correct. It is symbolic of this hurdle you've got to get across. But I think really viva isn't there to trip you up. It is a final test, but it's not this kind of whirling dervish of sitting there and just being bombarded with questions. I think everyone's viva is slightly different. I know that I left mine feeling slightly underwhelmed because I was preparing for this ordeal, and it was actually quite enjoyable, but in a way that made me think, have I missed something? Were they just being really easy on me? And it turned out I just had really nice examiners who were interested in the work. So bearing in mind that everybody's viva is different, a few things to think about are that your examiners, your Viva panel are your first audience, and you do need to write for them. You always write to an audience, but bear in mind this does not mean you should be sycophantic towards them, and you're not writing just for them. But the point is that they are the first people who are going to read and assess it. They're the people who will essentially decide whether this is good enough. So it would be silly to completely ignore them, and you are writing for them. So it's worth taking time to find out about your examiners. Think about how you cited their work in your thesis, what research interests of theirs intersect with yours. I think a really key thing to do is only cite their work when it's relevant. Don't try and squeeze it in, because it does just look like you're sucking up. So people will know if their work is relevant, and if they're the key writers in this area and they've written on stuff directly relevant and it's missing, they're going to think that's a bit weird. Not out of necessarily any innate narcissism, but because the point of a PhD is to engage with current work, and I would hope that a good examiner won't be annoyed personally and take it out on you, but they'll think this suggests you've not done your homework about the field. But if your examiner is writing stuff relevant to your work, it's also a bit silly not to engage with them, so do check. Practice makes, if not perfect, incremental improvements, but it's a bit less snappy, isn't it? Practice makes incremental improvements. So try a mock Viva. Do take the opportunity to test yourselves. The first time you asked a challenging question that you've not got the answer to, you might freeze. It's best if that first time is not your Viva. So expose yourself to the environment. And speak to supervisors, speak to your mock panel about what you think the likely questions will be. I think you can always predict there'll be some nice open question about what your work is about. Tell us what you did. So prepare that. There are some general questions you can prepare for. And I guess it's always worth in your Viva being robust. So you must defend your work, but you must also do it in a respectful way. So don't, if your examiners get something wrong or miss something, even if you're seething inside, you think, well, this is on page so-and-so, did you even read it? Just bite your tongue and be respectful in defense of your work. And I guess finally in the Viva, the key thing is don't panic. Treat it like a conversation about your work. It is something that you can enjoy. It's possibly the first and quite likely the last time that you'll be sat in a room with two people but who are experts in your field, focusing purely on your work. You can potentially learn a lot during it as well. And bear in mind that if you're asked challenging questions, if your examiners highlight things they think you've missed or got wrong, that doesn't necessarily mean you'll fail. It won't necessarily mean corrections. A PhD can't cover everything. It's about what it's really reasonable and is essential to cover. And lots of examiners will ask questions just to test you. They don't necessarily expect that to have been in the thesis. What they want to do is see, can you think on your feet around the topic? Because they're testing you, they're checking to see, is this your work? Do you really know this subject? And are you, have you accomplished the level of learning and understanding to enter into the academy as a holder of a PhD? And I think that is where we will pause. I think we're a little bit over time. My apologies, Ted, but I think we are able to take questions now.
Thank you both very much, John and Mary, for that tour de force of tips. I think, if anything, it demonstrates why you both would be excellent PhD supervisors. So no doubt those of the participants who are thinking about embarking on PhD studies would be well inclined to consider both John and Mary, whether you're interested in bioethics or law. Let me allow everyone to unmute, and I don't know if the blue hand function, which I think is the Zoom hand, is enabled. But in any event, you can just either type your question into the chat box, of course, or somehow maybe just give notice to me that you want to ask a question by typing question into the chat box so we know who wants to pose a question to John and Mary. While people are doing that, maybe I will get started by asking one question. Something that I've sometimes seen in the, I see Harry's asked a question, which is great. John and Mary, I sometimes see in the PhD applications thinking in particular about that checklist of what should go in a proposal and that point about the outline of your plan for answering your research question. It gets me thinking about methods, both in terms of those in law who are familiar with doctrinal research, and sometimes this trepidation of feeling like that's inadequate, and thinking in particular about the interdisciplinary nature of health law and bioethics, sometimes feeling like there's a necessity to undertake empirical research to answer the research questions, even if the question might not in principle seem appropriate for an empirical component. And often there's a concern about trying to narrow down the methods or the scope of the proposal. Do either have any advice on the either adequacy of doctrinal research itself, or when an applicant wants to engage in empirical research, tips for how that can be structured in a way that's appropriate for a 3-year PhD?
That's really tricky to answer in general. So I'll make a general point, and my apologies to anybody in the audience who's heard me bang on about this before, but I guess people often think about what is the best method or what is the right method, and I think that's the wrong question. It's like asking what is the best piece of cutlery. It's a tool. A spoon is great if you got soup, it's rubbish if you're eating spaghetti. The tool depends on the job you want it to do, and research methods are all about that. So, and this is why I think Mary focused on the research question. You get your research question, and then you have to think about what the most appropriate method to answer that question is. So for my part, I would say, yes, doctrinal research is absolutely adequate, but not if your question is empirical. And similarly, if you've got a question that is empirical, you need some kind of empirical element, but it's not essential, because in bioethics, I'd say one of the things we want is normative as well. So I think this is why it's going to be important to speak to supervisors as well, to specify your question, and then you think what is the best method for that question. From my point of view, anything goes so long as it fits, as long as it can be justified.
Yeah, I would just second that. I think the important thing is that there's a match between the question and the methodology. Obviously, there's going to be a huge problem if you're asking a question that seems to require and necessitate some sort of empirical investigation and you don't mention empiricism in your methodology. So I think that's something that hopefully a supervisor would pick up, and you would want that to happen in discussion with them before the application is formally submitted. So that's yet another reason, as Jonathan says, to have those early formative discussions with the supervisor, rather than just landing a proposal on their desk that may include an issue like that.
Thank you both very much for getting the Q&A started with that thorough answer to my difficult question, perhaps. I see there's a couple of questions that have appeared in the chat box, and thank you, Emery, for also stewarding the chat box there. We'll start with Harry Hudson's question, who asks, when you're thinking of doing interdisciplinary research, so for example, both law and politics of health, how should you approach finding a supervisor, particularly when you aren't sure which department of research would be the most appropriate, given the interdisciplinary nature of the topic that you're thinking about doing?
Jonathan, do you want to answer?
Can do. I can give it a go. I think it's a really good question. What I would do, or my advice would be to look at who's writing and what you want to do. So who is writing the papers that make you excited about this interdisciplinary area, and do a bit of research on them. Because if they're exciting you, they're probably working with the methods and approaches you like. And then the thing to do is to make inquiries. So all you can do is kind of dip a toe in the water. So find somebody who's doing the kind of work you want to do and approach them. If they ignore you or tell you to sod off, chances are they wouldn't be a great supervisor. So now you know. If they reply kindly and are interested in your work, then take it from there. But I think there's no hard and fast rule. But if you want to do interdisciplinary research, you want a supervisor who is either doing it themselves or who is very interdisciplinary friendly, but then you'll need a supervisory team with the expertise that between them they can offer supervision. And that's exactly what I had. I had a bioethicist, a psychologist, and a sociologist, and none of them could give me exactly what I needed, but between them they did.
Yeah, if I could perhaps just join in the sense that I also had to try and find a supervisor. I wasn't sure whether I was going to do it in politics or law as applied to health. And I found it really helpful to go around and meet potential supervisors. And as Jonathan said, I suppose get a sense of what they were writing, whether what they were writing was of interest to me and what sort of support I could get. And I found that very useful. And I knew right away when I met the person who would become my PhD supervisor that it was going to be a good fit, because something that was emphasized in the talk is that you're going to be working with these people for quite a while. So you want to know that it's going to be a good fit for you. Something to think about down the track if you want a law career, for example, is how, if you're going to work outside that discipline, for example, how you would progress your career in terms of publications down the track. And that I think Jonathan's idea of having a cross-disciplinary PhD supervisory team may be a way to deal with that. Thanks.
Thanks, Mary. Mary, did you want to come in to answer Harry's question too?
No, I think I just added to what Jonathan said.
Okay, brilliant. We'll just work through. I'm conscious of time, but we have some time, and we'll make sure that all the questions in the chat box are answered either by typing responses or at least starting to engage with them. So next is from Natalie. Natalie's at the stage of contacting potential supervisors. And the question is, do you have any advice on what to include in an initial informal inquiry? Email, and there's addition says there's mention of including a full proposal, and that can be too long to engage with, and obviously will change with the input of one supervisor. And Natalie adds, I want to make clear that I have a good idea of my research question already. Would a short summary proposal be a good balance?
Yeah, so I think, Natalie, you're right. It would be too much in the first initial contact to include a full proposal. I think when we get those sorts of contacts, we do find it a bit off-putting, because we would like to be involved in the process of formulating the proposal or helping you to develop the proposal. So yes, I think what you're suggesting sounds good. It's a very good question. How do you make initial contact with somebody who you may want to supervise your PhD, which seems like such a huge thing? You do want to give them the impression that you know your area and that you're a viable PhD applicant. But you need to strike the balance, as you say, something short of a full proposal, well short, I would say, of a full proposal. We're just talking about an email. So I would say that you seem to have the right idea with giving them an idea of what you see your research question as being, with a bit of summary, not much, but just a bit of summary, and maybe explain to them what your background is and why that question or subject is drawing you in, where you're coming from, what your reasons are for wanting to do it. So if you look back to the checklist on one of the previous slides about the kinds of things that you would put in your proposal, I think maybe it's a microcosm of that. So saying, you know, what your academic credentials are. So for example, if you're a master's student somewhere, saying, you know, I'm currently doing an LLM by research at X institution. I have been focusing on this, and what has emerged out of my master's research is that I have a burning desire to interrogate this other question in more depth, and just tell them how you've got to where you are briefly, what you now want to research, and why you would like to do it with them.
The only thing I'd add to that, so I think what Mary's said is spot on, but I'd also say it's worth checking your supervisor's department or the person you're thinking of contacting, checking their kind of unit, their centre, and just seeing if they've got a process. So at Bristol, for example, we recently introduced a link to a little form that structures, that tells people exactly what we want to know, because that just saves us time writing back individually. So we've got a form that we ask you. So if you email us at the moment, we will just send you back a link to the form, and the expectation would be that if you've done your homework, you would have found it. And we don't ignore emails, but we do just say fill in the form. So if you check what the centre says and check if there are any processes and follow those, that's always a good idea as well.
Thank you both. And I see Anne-Marie has helpfully answered Anna's question in the chat box. I think you partly answered Isaac's question, which is the last one, and then we'll take the break and thank John and Mary. But do you want to add anything? So Isaac's question is, would you say that it would be important for a member of your profession, if approaching PhD as a healthcare professional, if a member of your profession ought to be represented in your supervisory team?
I'd say only if they bring expertise that is important and necessary. So I think if it's a topic they don't know about and it's simply for the sake of having somebody there, then no, I think it's not important, because a PhD isn't assessed on the basis of the profession you work in. It's assessed on what you're producing now in this research environment. But if your topic is a clinical area where you need that clinical expertise and advice and insight, then yes, absolutely. I think it's not necessary, but should be included if it's needed and if it adds value.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it would be a waste of a supervision space to include somebody just to tick a box like that. I think that your supervisory team needs to be the academic team, because a PhD, I suppose if you're talking about medical law and bioethics and not some clinical specialism, as Jonathan says, if your PhD is in medical and bioethics, I think what you want is a supervisory team with expertise in those fields, or if it's an interdisciplinary PhD, you might want to bring in somebody from another field. So, for example, I'm supervising one at the moment where we've brought in expertise from constitutional law and also from criminal law, because it's a PhD on the end of life. So I think getting the right team together is something that's not really about. It's about getting people with the right specialisms and expertise together to make sure that the project is properly served.
I think that's a wonderful way to end this first session. I wish we were in person, partly so we could hear the round of applause for you both for taking the time out of your busy schedules to deliver a fantastic session on constructing a PhD proposal and writing the PhD proposal, and then mastering the viva itself. And I see Alana's got the virtual hand clap up. So that's what we'll do in the absence of a face-to-face meeting. But thank you both very much, Jonathan and Mary, for taking the time to deliver a fantastic opening session. Colleagues, everyone will take a 10-minute break now, and then we'll start at 11:30 for the second session of today, which will be on writing and publishing your research. That'll be led by Mikey Dunn and Sarah Fovark. So we'll take a 10-minute break and see you then. And thank you again very much, Jonathan and Mary.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ted. Pleasure.